Hello, I'm Yulayan, or you can call me Etiba. Today, I would like to get you to be able to introduce people in a formal setting. Let's delve in right away. Before we start, the first thing I would like you to pay attention to is this. Number one, you introduce someone in a lower position to someone in a higher position. Let's assume a new employee has just been hired in your organization. The employee's name is Mr. A for the sake of this class. And you are taking the person around and you take the person to Mr. B's desk. The only thing you have to look at is Mr. A, which is the new guy. Is he in a lower position compared to Mr. B or in a higher position compared to Mr. B? If Mr. A is in a lower position to Mr. B, you introduce Mr. A to Mr. B. But if Mr. A is in a higher position compared to Mr. B, you would introduce Mr. B to Mr. A. The second thing is you introduce a man to a woman, not the other way around. You introduce a man to a woman. But this rule can be broken if the man is in a higher position than the woman's position. That is where the third rule comes in. If the man is in a higher position than the woman's position, introduce the woman to the man. So let's delve into you actually doing the introduction. The simplest form of introduction is using names with gestures. For example, Mr. James, Mr. Sean. That means Mr. James have to be the person in a higher position, and Mr. Sean has to be the person in a lower position. Mr. James, Mr. Sean. That means I'm saying Mr. James, see, Mr. Sean is our new hire. Or you can just say, Mr. James, this is Mr. Sean, is our new hire. And if it's a male to a female, or yes, a male to a female, you mention the woman's name first, because the woman is not the one being introduced to the man, it's the other way around, except it is in a situation like we discussed in rule 3. So that would be Mrs. Johnson or Miss Johnson. This is Mr. James. That's a bit less formal. Now let's take it a notch higher. Let's make it more formal. Now put in mind that the person you are introducing should be mentioned last. The person you are introducing should be mentioned last. Like I said, Mr. Sean is the one being introduced to Mr. James. Mr. Sean is the one being introduced to Mr. James. That's why we say Mr. James, Mr. Sean. Mr. James, this is Mr. Sean. And the more formal form will be using may I introduce or I'd like you to meet. Remember, we mentioned the person's whose name we want to introduce last. For example, Mr. James, may I introduce Mr. Sean? You can see the person's name is being mentioned last. Mr. James, I'd like you to meet Mr. Sean. The same thing for a lady. If the lady is Miss Johnson or Mrs. Johnson, you'd mention Miss Johnson first because you're introducing Mr. Sean to Miss Johnson. So it will be Mr. Johnson, I'd like you to meet Mr. James. Not Mr. James, I'd like you to meet Miss Johnson. No. Miss Johnson, I'd like you to meet Mr. James. Miss Johnson, I'd like you to meet Mr. James. Then the most formal would be using may I present. That would be you saying, may I present. That means you mention the person whose attention you need to grab, that you want to introduce this new person to. So you start with Mr. James, may I present Mr. Sean. And in the case of a woman, it will be Miss Johnson, may I present Mr. Sean. I hope with this few lessons we've had, you are able to grasp the basics. All right, let's practice. Introduction between Mr. John, the supervisor, and Mr. Paul, a new employee. You can use any of the methods of introduction that we mentioned. All right, if you said Mr. John, meet Mr. Paul, you're quite right. Or Mr. John, may I present Mr. Paul? You're very correct. Or Mr. John, I would like you to meet Mr. Paul. You're very correct too. So let's go to the second one. Introduction between Mr. Paul and Miss Shane. All right, if you said Mr. Paul meets Miss Shane, so I'm very incorrect. Remember, Miss Shane is a lady. Remember, we said that you introduce a man to a woman, so it has to be Miss Shane. I'd like you to meet Mr. Paul. Okay, the last one, introduction between Mr. Jackson, the supervisor, and Miss Laura. Okay, if you said Mr. Jackson, I'd like you to meet Miss Laura. You're very right. Do you remember why you're right? You're right because Mr. Jackson is the supervisor, under which probably Miss Laura will be working. So since Mr. Jackson is in a higher position, definitely Miss Laura, who is just coming in and is in a lower position, would be introduced to Mr. Jackson. So it would be Mr. Jackson, may I present to you Miss Laura. I hope you learned a lot in class today. See you next class. And if you want a one-on-one session, I have dropped a link for you in the description of how to get a one-on-one lesson with me. See you in class. Bye-bye.